like I said, we're going to talk about 4 topics tonight. The first, we're going to talk about a history of school funding in California. I think it's really important to understand where we've been as far as school funding is concerned to get it where we are today. The second piece, we're going to talk about the local control funding formula. This is the core of school funding in California. Really important to have a good kind of overview of that component. Third, we're going to talk about the school district budget process. That's what I was just mentioning around getting into how school districts decide how they're going to distribute money to their schools centrally throughout the entire system. And finally, at the end, we're going to talk through 4 recent events and challenges that are impacting California education today. Some are super recent around COVID. Some are on more of a 5, 10, 15-year time horizon, but are still really impactful. So these are kind of the 4 areas where we're going to spend time tonight. And so kicking it off, talking through a history of school funding. And so this really, as we talk about these 3 different components, this is really a focus on state and local taxes, right? Understanding where the state is getting its money from, how it's collecting that money is really core to understanding a lot of how school finance works. And so I'm gonna take us back to the 70s for a minute. And in the 70s, schools were mostly funded through property taxes, and property taxes for schools were great at that time for a number of reasons, right? I think people like their taxes to go to causes that are close to home. They feel really good about, like, I'm spending this dollar on property taxes and it's going to the school that my kid goes to down the street, right? And that's like, people feel better about paying their taxes. The problem with property taxes is that they're fundamentally inequitable, right? The communities that have kind of the lowest home values end up paying the least in property taxes, end up having the least money for their local schools, which then produces really inequitable education outcomes down the line. And so this is, if you're aiming for equity, this is not the system you want to go for by any means. And certainly, I'm glad that we've ended up in a place in California where we're not exclusively using the system anymore. The other thing about property taxes that's a positive is that they're stable, right? California is a state where property values just don't drop that much. They tend to either stay stable or go up and up and up, which means that if you're funding just based on property taxes, you're not going to see substantial drops over time, right? Even in the face of a recession, you're going to have funding that is overall like pretty stable, and schools aren't going to be that hard hit. Now, if you know anything about recent California history, you know that our schools do get hard hit by recessions, and that's because of something I'm going to talk about in just a second here. So kind of keep that piece in mind. So under this property tax system in the 70s, California was a leader in school funding. You may have heard in recent years, California has been 35th, 36th of kind of 51 states and territories in school funding. But in 1977, we were 6th, right? Alaska is over here at the top with some oil money, I guess. And you got a couple more states that are in the same realm of California. But really we were, California schools were, a triumph under this system, kind of system-wide, right? Not talking about in individual communities, like I discussed, there was major inequity within the system, but system-wide, they're spending a lot of money on schools relative to other states. But this all changed in 1978. In 1978, there was a ballot initiative called Proposition 13. You may have heard about it during the last election cycle because there was a big initiative in California to try to reform Prop 13, try to rethink that. That didn't pass. But Proposition 13 was essentially a response to skyrocketing property values in California. California was a popular place to go. People really wanted to be here. That meant that property values rose and rose and rose and rose. And it meant that people's taxes rose and rose and rose and rose. So if people bought a property at this level, but all of a sudden their property's worth this much and this much and this much, suddenly they're paying an increasing amount of taxes that they might not be able to afford. And so there was like a significant backlash to how this like property tax system was impacting folks who had to pay those property taxes and potentially couldn't anymore, right? You see in this thing, our taxes tripled, how about yours, right? And so Prop 13 actually passes. And this has some pretty immediate and devastating effects on school funding in California. So I want to talk through 3 kind of components of Prop 13 that are really important. The first is that all property taxes, both residential and commercial, get frozen at 1975 rates. You'll remember that actually this passed in 1978. So we're rolling it back a couple of years when Prop 13 passes, right? The second is that property taxes get assessed at 1% of whatever the purchase price is, and they have really limited annual increases. And the third piece is that after Prop 13, if you want to raise local revenue for schools, if you want to pass a parcel tax, now it requires a 2/3 majority instead of a simple majority, right? And so these have 3 big impacts. The first, freezing property taxes at 1975 rates mean that schools lose about a third of their funding immediately. There was such an enormous kind of growth during that period in California that setting it back meant that schools saw a huge and immediate decline in funding, which is, devastating for districts to have to figure out how they're going to do that. So that's kind of an immediate emergency. Limiting annual increases on property taxes to 2% means also that school funding stops keeping track with the cost of living, right? When you have COLAs, cost of living adjustments that are 3%, 4%, but you can't raise property taxes that much, suddenly you start to get this widening gap because between what your property tax base can support and what schools actually need, right? And so that's a pretty that's more of a long-term issue that's led to California's kind of drop throughout funding levels as we compare it to other states. And finally, this last piece, the 67% threshold to raise local revenue, that means it's just way more difficult to raise future taxes to address this issue. If you're part of a community that wants to support education, that wants to put more money into your education system, it's fundamentally just substantially more difficult to get that 2/3 vote than it is to get a simple majority vote to do a parcel tax or something like that to raise additional money for your schools. So all in all, schools after Prop 13 are in a substantially worse financial situation. Moving forward a little bit, so after Prop 13, California can't rely on property taxes nearly as heavily anymore, right? They're just not producing enough income to support schooling in the way California needs. And so this is kind of the diverse funding mix that California relies on today to fund their public schools. About 60% of the money comes from state income taxes mostly, right? And so that's money that people are, either paying based on income from their jobs or wages. It also is money that people earn from capital gains. So that's like selling stock and things like that, right? Notably in California, and I'll talk about this in a second, IPOs, initial public offerings, fall under capital gains oftentimes. And so when you hear these big tech companies like doing, crazy IPOs, they're going to actually raise a lot of money for the state of California. Only about 20% now comes from property taxes. 12% across the state is coming from other local sources. So state or localities have put down parcel taxes. They can raise interest revenue through various ways, but that's where that kind of 10% is coming from here. You get another approximately 10% from federal funds and a little bit of money from the state lottery, right? The kind of key takeaway I want you to have from here is that 60% is coming from income taxes and from capital gains. And so what that does to our state funding level, to our state funding in California, is it makes it a much less stable mix than property taxes were. And so what I've highlighted down here, this is a graph that shows how California average funding has changed over time, excuse me, in comparison to the rest of kind of the United States. And what you see is that in recessions here and here and here, California experienced like a pretty steep drop in education funding, while nationwide, in the Great Recession, you saw something of a dip nationwide, but in the dot-com burst right here, most everything else stayed stable. And the reason for that is that California is so reliant on income taxes. So if people are losing their jobs, that's not funding that's available to them. And also they're reliant on capital gains taxes. And so if the stock market crashes, suddenly they're not getting that funding source anymore. And so when a recession hits in California now, it can have a much more substantial impact than in other states that rely more primarily on property taxes and don't have some of the impacts of Proposition 13. Okay, so that's my overview of kind of state and local taxes, of a history of California education. And so for a second, I want to move us over to the Jamboard to kind of gather some notes. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to add 2 things that you learned in this session and 1 question you still have after the session is over. And so I'm going to hop over to there and show you all how this works for a minute and kind of a demo. Cool. So once you get into the Jamboard, what you will see, and I'll put this in the chat real fast as well. There are up here, you can change the slide you're on in the Jamboard. And so there are 8 of them. These first 2 are for this history of school funding section. They're the blue slides. The first one is things I've learned tonight. The second is questions I still have. And what you can do once you're on here is you can come over to the side and you can grab a Post-it note from right here. You can click on that. You can type your question here. And then if you save it, it'll get added to the slide itself. So once again, hoping folks can add 2 things they've learned tonight, 1 question, and we'll give folks, let's say I don't know, 5 minutes or so to kind of add those, and folks can take a second if they need. Oh yeah, thanks, Marva. We'll translate the messages, so want to make sure that folks feel comfortable adding them in whatever language you feel comfortable in.
If you are feeling stuck on Jamboard, feel free to come off mute and we can offer tech support for this first round. If anyone's feeling a little bit stuck, just let us know.
Also, if folks want to just throw their questions in the chat, we can transfer them over as well. So if that's easier for you, throw your question in the chat. Cool. I'm seeing some warnings in here around the importance of kind of capital gains taxes, around why California can have such a volatile school funding system. Oh, we just lost it somehow. Any questions folks have that either you want to throw in the Jamboard or just into the chat here? Hearing none, if you have some throughout, please go ahead and add them in. We can kind of take questions. Oh, what's an IPO? Cool. An IPO is an initial public offering. That's when a company starts listing shares on one of the stock exchanges. And so what can happen is companies can use that to raise lots and lots of money. It means that for some of these big tech companies, some of their employees get very, very wealthy very, very quickly. Shares that had only like kind of an estimated value or potentially weren't even worth that much, or suddenly worth tons and tons of money. Lots of those people cash out, sell those shares. That produces significant capital gains taxes, which then produces increases in what's available for school funding across the state, right? So we'll talk about like what happened during the pandemic later on tonight, if there were actually lots of like IPOs that raised lots of money. And so Gilberto, I can grab that source for you. I don't have it off the top of my head. I think it's from a PPIC report, the Public Policy Institute of California. But I would be happy to kind of follow up with that. Was there another purpose of Prop 13? It was mainly to protect their property taxes, right? It was folks feeling, trying to, have a lot of grace for folks towards something that like I feel kind of strongly about, since I am not a fan of things that so negatively affect California. But like, I think it did meaningfully impact people's ability to kind of provide for their families and to kind of take these property taxes in stride. And they were trying to come up with a solution that was going to allow them to keep themselves financially sustainable without having to leave the state. And so I think that's my kind of my with grace answer. And I think it was, I'll just stop there.
Feels a bit like maybe a very short-term solution for an immediate problem that no one thought through the long-term impact. People often say, why do we fund so low in California? We know exactly how this happened, but it solved a very short-term problem with a long, painful solution.